She draped his braid over the prow. Salt black hair clung to tar-dark wood. A gull cut low and went silent. Asa's hands did not tremble. The longship sighed against the quay like an animal letting go. Oars bumped in their tholes, ropes hummed taut, and the men on the deck folded themselves into silence as Kveldstrand leaned out to watch. Smoke crawled from hearths. A dog barked once and was shushed by a woman who had seen too many returns to hope. At the rail, Asa cupped the rim of a round shield. Its paint scuffed into a bruise where a blade had bitten. A braided strand of Irik's hair hung from its boss, knotted with a bit of bone where their mother had carved his rune. The shield smelled of salt, tar, and something hotter. Iron, and the memory of a hand that would not grip a sword again. On the shore, Hakon waited where the quay widened. The chieftain's cloak was a sober gray. His smile was a thin ribbon of steel. He had the look of someone who had measured town things by law and found them wanting. When he stepped forward, the crowd gave space, like a river parting for a log that must pass. She held the dead man's jaw, and it unlatched with her fingers like a slackened knot. A round of iron fell from his belt and sang against the floor. Outside, Hakon's riders stamped snow from their cloaks. A dog's howl answered them. Sven stood in the doorway, breath a pale blade between men. Asa did not look up when Hakon crossed the threshold. The chieftain's braid, dark, braided with a silver thread, still caught in the dead man's hair. Asa brushed it aside with a thumb that trembled but would not be named weakness here. The iron disc was warm under her palm, as if the man's blood had only left it a moment past. "Hakon," Sven said, voice even. "We will speak." Hakon let his gaze travel the room like a spear. He smelled of smoke and the wet iron of men who had ridden hard. "There is a price for blood," he said. "You killed a man who wears a mark of rank. The Vergild for chieftains' men is not like for any other. We will have the coin, and we will have the proof." Proof. The word hit the longhouse rafters like a thrown knife. Asa folded the disc between her fingers and saw the stamped knot. The 3 loops braided into a rune she had only seen on the belts of men who carried another man's name. It was the mark Halfur. The distant chieftain who collected oaths from others, gave to those he trusted. She knew then why the man had been so poorly dressed, but walked like a lord's shadow. Sven's face was a hard country. "If he bore that mark, Hakon, you have cause," he said. "And if you have cause, we must close the debt before worse begins. The law keeps a household whole." Asa's laugh was a small, broken thing. "The law? Is that what you call leaving a sister to carry this?" She opened her hand and held the iron up. The knot glinted. He fought for his chieftain because he wore that knot. He did not fight for himself. He was a man with names on his tongue. Her voice stepped and missed Sven's eyes, found Hakon's. "Why must we pay for their allegiance?" Hakon folded his arms. "Because a chieftain keeps peace with coin. Because I have a thing to protect. My peace with Halfur. And it is cheaper to take Vergild than to make war. Prove he carried the knot and the price is higher. Do not prove it, and the thing becomes an offense between us. Either way, you pay." Sven moved like a man settling a ledger. "We tally within the law. I will not let blood feed blood if a lawful settlement keeps children and fields intact. We pay what is due. You will not burn us for your lord's anger. That is the law." He did not look at Asa when he said the last words. He looked to the hearth, to the longhouse plan where obligations were weighed as stones on a scale. Then he reached for the chest where the household silver was kept. His hand closed around coins that were her father's life in metal. "You would hand our house to them?" Asa asked, voice stripped of anything but the facts of injury. "You would give our bread to buy their silence while their chieftain's men can walk among us again?" Sven's jaw eased like a sheath easing a blade. "I would have a house," he said. "A house with walls. A house with children growing without spear points at its throat. I will take the money to Hakon now." Hakon smiled with no teeth. "Then it is done. Show me the mark, and the account will be clear." Asa pushed past her brother. The longhouse narrowed at that instant into a throat. She fingered the knot on the iron disc until the metal bit her skin. "Then take it," she said. "Take the coin. But know this. If you hand over what you have and leave me with what I will become, the law you praise will be the cord that strangles me." Sven did not answer. He put the chest on his shoulder and went out into the smoke-stung light. Every step a division cut through the house. Hakon's men shifted, the scrape of mail, the metallic hush of power accounted. Asa watched Sven leave and felt the thing inside her split. Between duty kept and vengeance sold, only one thing could close: the weight of the iron in her palm. She raised it, and in the knot's shadow she saw the face of the man they'd killed. No friend of theirs, and not a stranger either, and the shape of a choice that would not be undone. If she handed the mark to Hakon and let Sven pay the Vergild, the household might live. But she would carry the fact of those coins as a brand. If she kept it, Hakon would burn them in the spring. Between the coin and the fire, Asa tasted the metal of both. A hand, black with tar, trembled as it traced a single gouge. Moonlight struck the cut and made it look like a small white knife. Asa smelled smoke and iron and the sea all at once. Somewhere behind her, someone began to cry. She did not shout. She only pushed the plank aside and crouched, fingers braced on wet wood. The dead man's cloak had been swept back as if by scrupulous hands. A small strip of flesh at the wrist was raw where rope had been. In the keel, beneath the blood-darkened straw, somebody had carved a rune so fine it could have been missed. An ehwaz reversed, then a cluster that spelled Erikar, the steward's name, all sharp and deliberate. "Not the sea," a voice rasped. Kettle stepped from the shadow of the mast, reeking of ale and mackerel, palms still smelling of rope. He would have been an untrustworthy witness in daylight. Tonight his eyes were fixed and steady. It was murder. "I saw him fall inside the creek by the kiln, not on some cliff," Kettle said, the words stripped of bravado. "Two men, one with the steward's sign on his cloak. I ran, I swore the runes to the tide, and the tide took my oath, but I carved this for him after, for the dead." Asa pressed the rune with her thumb. The wood bit into her nail. Her hearth had taught her the names of runes not as ornaments, but as nails that could fix a thing in law. To set a rune letter for someone was to make the accusation public. It bound obligations, blood price, vengeance. If she carried Eriker's name to the chieftain's hall, the steward's house would not sleep, and the town would divide in two clean parts. Kettle's breath made little fogs in the moonlight. "If you leave it here, the dogs will gnaw it. If you burn it, the dead will have no name. If you carry it..." He faltered, the risk transparent. She could hide the rune and say the dead fell in battle, preserve the uneasy peace and the steward's favor. She could burn the plank and make the death anonymous, a lost thing no one could claim. Or she could take the rune letter to the moot and bind the steward with blood and law, knowing that once voiced, accusation cannot be gathered back. Asa wrapped the plank in the dead man's cloak, feeling the stiff weight of the accusation like a stone against her ribs. The waves kept time with a slow, patient tapping against the hull. She rose and stepped toward the quay, each footstep a decision. Kettle's hand moved to touch her sleeve and stopped, as if to pray. Moonlight slid across the rune and left a white slit on the wood. She walked with the rune pressed to her breast, and with every step the town's faces rearranged in her mind. Friends she would betray, a child who would cry his name, a steward who would close his fist and choose war over shame. She did not yet know which life she was carrying toward ruin, only that once she spoke the name aloud at the moot, the town's breath would split to either side, and nothing would be whole again. A shawl slapped onto the meeting stone, white rimmed with dark, like frost on meat. Sigrun's voice split the air, thin and steady. He was my husband, he was mine. The crowd pressed closer, boots and breath and the clack of shields. Hakon watched them all as if weighing iron. Sigrun folded the shawl and laid it flat. On it she set a crooked knife, the kind cut from an old grindstone, dull with use, and traced the nicked haft with a finger that trembled but never left the knife. Her grief was a tool, every sigh calibrated to bring the thing to a point. They named him Kiel, she said, as if naming were a ritual wound. They called him father. He went down by a woman's blade. The words did not need to scream. Their precision made them sharper. Faces turned, murmurs like dry leaves. Asa stood beside the longhouse pole, hands empty. Her plea was small and sudden. It was not strike for spite. He came at us with a club. Her voice broke. I stopped him. She held the claim as one holds a child from falling. Tight, terrified, essential. Hakon's reply was not a roar, but a measuring. He set a rune staff upright between them, tapped it with a knuckle. The law flowed from his mouth in sure, even sentences. Who may claim? What counts as slaying? What compensation might quiet a hand reaching for swords? The words were cold workmanship. The crowd soaked them in like men used to winter. Wergild, he said finally. Value of a man. If the claimant refuses, the law grants the slayer choice. Duel, exile, or payment. This thing will record the choice. The air tasted of smoke and old iron. Hakon's calm tasted like iron and ash. Sigrun's face went from grief to something like calculation. No payment will bring him back, she said. Coins do not take the cold from his skin. She rose, slow as a tide, and the knife on the shawl glinted. I want blood. The crowd leant. A child cried and was silenced. A man muttered about sorrows and cycles. Another pressed a hand on his sword's pommel. Hakon lifted both palms, not a shield, but a stop. Law offers its ways. Choose. Asa could ask the thing to judge self-defense and demand the law. A rope lay across the yard like a reed broken at the waist. Men froze with their hands on the knot as if mid-prayer. Hakon's shadow fell long over the planks. Asa smelled tar and iron and the shape of a verdict. The rope came first, hauled by two men from the chieftain's longhouse. It snaked over the threshold and around the longboat's prow, wrapped once, twice, finished with a toggle that looked like a throat. Boys stopped kicking their stones. Women at the fire stopped kneading. The hammering at the boat's ribs paused as if the wood itself held its breath. Hakon stood with his cloak unfastened so the silver brooch over his heart flashed like a claim. He did not need to shout. The law lived in his shoulders. By the chieftain's will, he said, and his men nodded, as if some old rune had been read in the smoke. The boat stands until the debt is satisfied. It is collateral. Leave the rope. Let no one take it. Sven stepped forward. He had the same jaw as Hakon and the same flat kindness that made him good at bargains. He put a hand on the rope as if to steady the knot, and his other hand touched Hakon's sleeve. It is right, he said, voice small, careful as a trade. Our household must keep standing. To refuse brings shame on the hall. Let it be known we honor the law. Asa watched the fingers at the rope, the way Sven's palm rested on the wood like an oath. The hand that had once helped her hoist planks now pledged them away. Her mouth tasted of tar and iron, and something colder, like the ash from a hearth that will no longer be fed. She walked up the yard. The boat, Stormfugel, the thing that had kept them fed and feared, tilted slightly as the men adjusted the moorings. Up close, she could see where children had carved initials beneath the gunwale, where a small knot of rope had frayed and been spliced by her own hands last winter. Property had weight. It had history. It had, until this morning, a purpose. Hakon watched her with the rest, but his eyes were given to law, not to her. "You know the terms," he said. "Leave the rope. The chieftain takes responsibility. Mark it on the shard." "Aye," Sven murmured, as if assuring he put the torch to the tarred sail and hesitated. Embers coughed, orange against the longhouse shadow. Hakon's fingers tightened on wood so hard his knuckles whitened. Somewhere outside, the sea remembered its name. The longhouse smelled of smoke-stale mead and boiled goat. The fire pit sent up thin, tired sparks. Men and women sat along benches like teeth in a jaw, watching the narrow space between two men. Hakon, narrow-shouldered, eyes braided with loyalty. And the stranger, Leifr, whose hair had the gray of sea foam and whose smile cut like a flint. Leifr did not stand like a man claiming mercy. He moved like a man who had already lost what he feared. "We burn the ship," he said. His voice was flat as an oar. "We take the men inland. We are no longer tied here." A laugh, low and startled, worked through the hall. "We are not dogs," said one of Hakon's kin. "We do not throw away our house." "You call it a house," Leifr replied, "but the keel is law. To leave it is to leave claim and obligation. Let the keel burn and no one can demand you back. No man can bind what has been turned to ash." Hakon's hand went to his sword as if the hilt were a word he could draw. "You are reckless," he said. The word was a stone thrown into water, rings widening across the benches. Leifr planted the torch on the bench and told a small, true thing. "Another winter I watched men of my bond be taken by a chieftain for debt none of them owed. They bled under house law and left nothing but wives' groans and children with no names. We burned then. We took to the forest for a season, and when we came back we were outlaws, but we were alive. Alive is a kitchen hearth. Honor that leaves you dead is not honor." The story did not glamour him. His knuckles were white from many ropes. His cheek bore a scar that ran like a rude rune. He spoke as one who had chosen the edge of law when law would have chosen his skin. "What of sons?" Hakon asked. The question was private and catastrophic. "My name, my father's doors. You would see them owe blood because I set the wood to flame?" "If you return," Leifr answered without heat, "they will make you give blood for others' blood. You will not walk free. You will go to lash and ledge under someone else's axe. Better to be free men without a hall than men under a debt that is not ours." Smoke touched the rafters, a ghost that made the faces go brittle. Around them the crew shifted, some eager, some afraid, some already counting losses as folded cloth. A boy no older than a summer stood at the doorway, his eyes reflecting the torch like a question. Hakon imagined his father's bench, the smell of cured meat, his daughter's hair braided the way his mother had braided it. He could see the field where he'd once raced horses, the oligarchic ritual of feast and claim. All that could be burned with a torch. He felt the long, thin hand of the law, unforgiving, precise, resting on his shoulder whether he wanted it or not. Leifr took up the torch again and held it out the way a priest might offer a rite. "We do not burn for vengeance," he said. "We burn so we may choose who we will be. We make our exile a ship of men that answers only to itself." Hakon heard the logic as if it were a blade at his throat, and he could not tell whether it cut for life or for death. The hall waited like a buried animal, breath small and quick. Hakon could step forward and set the keel afire, and everything would be undone. Father's houses lost, allies abandoned, his name stripped clean. He could refuse and return with a hull to the next. The oar lay flat on the wet sand, its grain shining like a palm. Sven's knife trembled the same way his hand had trembled the night she ran. Hakon stood where tide met law, the chieftain's shadow a clean cut across the crowd. Asa looked at him as if he could still be made to look away. Gulls wheeled and the sea hissed at a distance. Closer, voices rose and cracked like dry wood. The hearing had the shape of a ship. Prow of witnesses, bench of elders, the oar as keel and law. Hakon's men formed a thin wall, their spears angled like punctuation. Villagers stood shoulder to shoulder, faces browned with salt and suspicion. First witness, Thorleif, a fisherman with wind-split lips. He stepped forward, nails black with tar, eyes that could not hide relish. She was there, he said, spitting sand between words. By the barn at dusk. I saw the door open, heard the scuffle. Her shawl caught on the peg. I took a turn, saw her shadow pass the fen. Asa's brother, Joan, moved as if to strike. Hakon's forearm held him. On the sand, small children watched, their knees scabbed, learning how the world declared guilt. Second witness. Ingrid, who brewed ale and knew where people meant to go, shook her head. No, she said. That was not Asa. I saw her the whole evening sitting by my hearth, her hands over her cup. She hummed a song as she untied its strings. Two stories, two directions. The crowd split like a rope being strained. The law required balance. The law Hakon wanted required certainty. Hakon's voice was quiet as a slap. Contradiction means we must bind testimony by weight. A man's sworn word will fall like a blade if it is sharpened by blood and ore. He stepped over the line of sand and placed the oar across a cleft log, the symbol of the ship, the symbol of the law. Let one who will take the oath speak and make it airless. Let his hand be seen. Let his allegiance be known. Sven felt the beach tilt. He had thought the night itself would hold his secret. Now the world demanded a name. In the crowd, Asa's face, pale as driftwood, chevrons of worry, held him like a compass. If he spoke, her path would be ended. Exile, or worse, a spear through the ribs is a man's shame. If he kept silence, Hakon could strike him down with fines or cart him from the house, his kin shamed. He heard Hakon's hand brush leather. Sven, the chieftain said, step forward. Let your word be counted. Let your blade and your blood be proof. Sven's throat closed. He remembered the night on the peat road, the soft sound of Asa's boots, the broken lantern, the smell of smoke and iron. He remembered the way her laugh had once set a child's bowl trembling. All of it collapsed into a single small motion. He stepped. The oar's wood was cool and tar-sticky under his palm. Hakon's sworn men drew a blade, thin, ceremonial, and pressed the tip into Sven's palm. It bit hot and immediate. The crowd inhaled as one animal. Sven's first breath was a betrayal. He lifted the blade and cut the inside of his hand in a practiced arc. Blood welled, bright and stubborn, and he pressed his palm flat against the oar. A mark bloomed on the grain, darkening like an omen. I swear, he said, and the words left him as if carved from bone. By blade and by oar, by the name of my father and the law of this land. Asa of Miri struck down Hroar. I name her before all men. Let this be proof. Silence fell soft but heavy. Some faces slackened into relief. Others tightened like ropes prepared to hold weight. Asa made no sound. Her hands balled into fists. Her lips moved. Was she mouthing a prayer, or her hand closed on wet rope as if on a throat? Moonlight cut the deck into silver scars. A single nail whispered when she stepped. The ship smelled of tar, fear, and old oaths. Asa moved like a thought not meant to be remembered. Silent, small, a shadow obeying the hull's creak. The sea hissed against the planks, a steady white lie that promised distance but delivered only salt and the dark. She knew every knot of the longship. She had slept under its ribs. Tonight, those ribs felt foreign. Under the thwart where the steersman's bench met the hull, she found the loose plank. Fingers bled in the salt dark as she pried it up. The nail yielded with a sound that could have been a voice. There, wrapped in oiled linen and smelling faintly of smoke, lay a token. A little whalebone amulet the size of a thumb, its face incised with a crude rune she had seen on Sven's belt buckle. A hair, thin, paler than any in her household, was knotted through it. She held it and remembered a laugher in the longhouse that had stopped, a child's whisper that stopped longer. The rune carved like a name, the hair like a ledger. The token fit into her palm as if it had been made to accuse. Bootsteps thudded somewhere beyond the stern. Men on watch or men drunk. Maybe Sven himself on his way to check the ropes. Panic sharpened. To be found with this would be to be found with a knife in the throat of custom. To leave it was to let him walk with proof in his pockets, untouchable when the day required it. Her braid lay heavy against her spine, a rope of work and reputation earned and owned by others. She thought of the law seat murmurs, of a brother's slow collapse the winter before, of a mother who folded her hands and looked at her as if she could shrink into nothing. There is a boundary a woman does not cross without the world noticing. She went for scissors, small, the kind used to trim threads in the sail. The metal tasted like river. With hands that did not shake, she cut one thick length of her own hair, the braid falling like a rope of dark grain. She bound the token to the end of it, knotting until the hair and bone were one thing. The act rang hollow and final in her chest. A shadow moved across the sail, and a boot scraped the gangplank. Asa slid beneath the bench, heart a drum in her ribs, the newly cut braid coiled against her breast. If Sven had hidden this, as the rune said he had, then the token made a conspirator of her. If she were found, the village A thumb pressed to a cracked lip. Gray water hissed at the pebbles. Sven's shadow lay longer than his confession. The town watched, a single slow animal. Asa stood with salt in the braid at the nape of her neck. The strand between longships and a lantern swung once and spit embers into the dusk. Asa's fingers closed on the torch as if it were the throat of a man. The ship's carved dragon breathed smoke into the cold. Hakon's shadow filled the keel like a verdict. Hakon spoke without rising from the gunwale. His beard caught the lamplight. His voice, low and even, had the authority of law and the weight of a blade. The longship stays here, as surety, until blood is paid, until Vergild is whole. My men watch the timbers. No ash will pass until the debt is settled. Around them the village leaned in. Men who had sailed with Hakon nodded. Women whose sons had died pressed flat palms together and said nothing. Leifer stepped forward, boots scuffing wet sand, eyes like a struck flint. He smelled of smoke already. Old fires, old grudges. Then burn it now, Leifer said. He had wanted the ship all along in a way that made his voice loose with need. If Hakon holds it, he holds our movement. He ties our hands with his watchmen and his law. If it burns, he cannot bind us to his terms. Let the sea take it. Let it be funeral and freedom. Asa could see the ship as both answer and accusation. Her brother's oars, the places carved with his names, the cloth of voyages, the black pitch-ceiling seams he had caulked. The torch in her hand felt neither warm nor her own. She had not come to choose between property and ceremony. She had come to choose what they would be when they remembered her family. Hakon laughed once, a dry bark. Burning is a thing of claim, woman. If you set fire while I hold collateral, You destroy what belongs in law to settle a debt. You cannot strike at what might be used to pay the blood. If you kindle flame now, you do not free yourself. You make a public answer that you prefer ruin to recompense. You make the ship yours, and you end the Vergild forever. A woman at Asa's shoulder, old Sigrun, who had lit funeral fires before the bones cooled, murmured, "Burning is a pronouncement. It names the dead and the living's right to him. It is oath as much as ash." Her fingers, laced with calluses, pressed into Asa's sleeve, and for a moment the old woman's judgment was nearer than Hakon's law. Leifr spat on the sand. "He will call it theft and press blood on us. He will say you tried to hide the prize. But what is worse? A watch upon the keel, or a watch upon your throat for refusing his claim?" The wind found the torch and teased the flame. Sparks rose like small, bright birds. The men on Hakon's side tightened. A boy on the shore started to cry and was hushed. Asa thought of her brother's last breath, of the promise that had been made in the mead hall, of the face of the man who had died counting on Vergild to settle his house. She saw the ledger of obligations, a chain that might be left to rust by time if the Vergild was paid, or snapped forever if she burned the wood. Her choice was an action that could not be undone, to light the ship as funeral, and thereby claim it, forswear the Vergild, and invite whatever law or revenge came next, or to surrender it to Hakon and trust the slow, uncertain sums of honor and debt. She lifted the torch. Leifr's hand went to hers. Hakon straightened like a struck spear. Flame kissed the tarred braid at the prow. A hot, resinous smell stung the throat. The first black smoke unmade the edges of the sea. Asa looked not at the iron clanged once. A sound like a last tooth falling from a skull. Asa's fingers found the warm rim of the ring and would not let go. A man's breath came quick behind her, like a tide that had paused and now must break. Far forward, the oars lay still. The world narrowed to that metal and her palm. Kettle knelt with his wrists bared. The rope burned bright under his nails. Hakon stood above him, cloak heavy, voice low and precise as an oath. "The law is the law." Behind the words sat something quieter and older. A plan to close every river mouth that might let a rival slip away. Rumor moved like smoke. Exile, not death. Skagar, they called it in whispers. Banishment into the trees, stripped of name, kin, hearth. A man sent there did not earn a mound, did not count for blood price. He simply stopped being part of the world that mattered. The crew watched in a tight ring. Berger held his jaw like a blade. He had the chieftain's favor and the money to pay fines. Eir, who had mended Asa's braid after the winter raid, had fingers trembling on the hem of her tunic. Sigurd, Asa's brother by oath, not by blood, leaned against the mast with a silence that tasted like betrayal. Hakon's hand rested on Ketil's shoulder, a mock of pity. "There is a way," he said. "Swear, Osa. Lay down your claim to the sword's runes. Swear you answer to me. Ketil serves a fine penance, and your house keeps its place." He offered legal submission like a blade wrapped in goatskin. Not mercy, but mastery. The alternative he named without flourish. Exile for anyone who helped Ketil flee. Exile for anyone who refused the oath. Asa's mind mapped the possible endings like stones. Submit, keep the name, live with a private barbed shame. Strike now, spill Hakon's throat, and gamble the ship descends into murder and blood price. Or cut ties so clean that even memory could not reach. A symbolic rupture that would leave her as empty and free as a scourged bone. Each stone was a wound. Berger stepped forward, voice steady. "We take the law. We do not make outlaws without thing or witnesses." He looked at Asa as if she were a ledger to be balanced. Eir's hand went to Ketil's rope. "We run. she said under her breath. We run for the scaries. We leave names to rot. Her eyes caught Asa's. Fear was in them, but so was an invitation. Sigurd's fingers tightened on the haft of his knife. Hakon keeps order, he murmured. And the words were not comfort. He moved to stand between Asa and Hakon, not to shield her, but to hold counsel with the chieftain. The boat's center hummed with a new gravity. Friends found themselves pulled into orbits they had not chosen. Asa stepped close to Kettle. Up close, she smelled the damp wool and the salt of 2 nights without sleep. She felt the deck under her soles, the fragile give of planks lashed to one another. A thing she could either loosen or sever. Her knife slid from its sheath. It sang a small, sharp sound. Fingers on iron. Everyone's breath narrowed, as if waiting for a bell. Before she could think, before the bargain in Hakon's eyes could harden into law, she moved to the rope. Sigurd's hand struck her wrist, not hard enough to break bone, hard enough to name treachery. Air shoved between them, nails catching Sigurd's cheek. His hand bled, red and quick. Kettle's head snapped up. Do it, he mouthed. Do it and be done with it. Hakon's laugh was small and empty. So, he said, choose then. Make one action that marks you. Asa's blade saw the weave of rope, the narrowness of the knot. The world pressed in. The rope, the iron ring, the eyes of friends and traitors. She could cut and be outlawed. She could keep still and be counted among the tame. She could take Hakon's life, and all would change to blood forever. She slit the cord. The rope fell in a soft, final whisper. Kettle sprang, not at Hakon, but for the open side of the ship. A torch broke the dark like a reprimand. Asa's fingers smelled of tar and old iron. The keys lay in her palm, weight like a promise. Across the fjord, beacons stitched fire into the sky. They moved as shadows under the boathouse eaves. 3 men and 2 women whose faces she had fed and calmed for years. No songs, no prayers. Only the soft clink of leather and the animal breath of people who had slept within the same roof as her. Asa unlatched the heavy door and the smell of cured fish and warm oak rolled out, intimate and dangerous. Keys, Thorstein whispered, voice thin as a reed. His hand hovered over the iron. He had been a boy when she first taught him to pull oars, a man now who still flinched at thunder. She did not glance at the faces behind her. The torch was already smoke and hunger. Wood remembered every oath like a bone remembers break. Asa breathed once and let the flame answer. The torch bit the keel. For a long heartbeat time, the fire took like a thought. Slow, terrible, deliberate. Black smoke went up in a column that smelled of tar and old rope. It dragged memory with it. Men on the strand spat and clapped hands to mouths. A child began to howl and was clapped silent by a calloused palm. The first plank sighed and split with a sound like a man giving up blood. Sven lunged before any word could make him a traitor. His hand slid across the rough wood, bright as if he might smother the ember with his fingers. Asa did not move her hand away. He caught the sleeve at the wrist. Her skin was cool under his palm. Bone past all the stories. Their eyes met. Hunger, grief, the shallow surprise of someone who had counted on law until an instant ago. Halt! Hakon thundered, standing like a broken hill, his voice sending men forward and women back. Seize her. By oath and by right, seize her. The chest of men filled the beach. Boots struck wet sand. Spears found purchase. One of Hakon's men lifted a net. Another tried to yank the torch. Sven turned, gripping Asa's arm with a force born of both fear and outrage, pulling toward him as if to wrench her from the singular intent in her face. She smiled with all the cruelty of the sea. If you would bind us with keel and name, she said, low and leveled, then let the law have what it made. I will not let this be kept as proof to hang us on. Her voice was small amid the shouts. She shaped no rune. She spat the old words like a blade. She pushed the torch into the wood with both hands. Sparks bled out, throwing copper flecks into Sven's hair. He tried to scoop and stamp, a ridiculous human thing against pitch that drank water like a vow drinks blood. Men fell upon him by order and by muscle. Hakon's command was sharp enough that they obeyed before they understood. Iron met flesh. A shoulder went out of socket under weight of bodies. Sven tasted salt and burnt cloth. The torch rolled and stuck, the fire catching with a greedy, clean intention. The keel flared. Names chiseled under the gunwale, names of kin and claim, flickered and disappeared into smoke. Each man there heard it, the intimation that law would now be read in another tongue. Asa did not scream when the flames licked her hands. She did not cry when smoke made her eyes water. She had gone to the shore intending to break one thing in order to break all the arrangements that kept them pawns. Hakon barked as though the very rules had been insulted. He ordered chains, dragged arms, the first marks of outlawry to be laid now rather than later. Men screamed, some with pain, some with the new, immediate dread that the world had just narrowed to flight. The ship bucked itself into a shape of ruin, ribs popping like knuckles. Sven found his hand freed in a moment of animal desperation and ran to the rail, slashing at the burning keel until the smoke choked him. He saw, under a rind of black, a name he had carved as a boy. He stabbed at the letters with a dagger that left a scar in ash. The fire took the wood and the law with it. The night filled with a new music. Crack, cry, oath undone. Men who had been brothers by the turn of a keel now stood with open hands and no place to lay them. Asa, ash on her face, let the torch go. The heat pulled something from her, as if burning could loosen a tether tied in blood. She had chosen. There could be no unchoosing. Outside the circle of flame, Hakon's men tightened. Sven's chest rose and fell like a trapped gull. Somewhere, a bell of the Thing House in the settlement would soon toll a summons and bring writs, swords, and judgment. They were already outlaws the moment the fire ate the carved names. What remained was who would pursue them, and what mercy, if any, would answer a woman who had set her own kin to flame. Her shoulder smoked where the ash had settled. A single crow landed on the ruined mast and shook itself free of soot. Asa bit the inside of her cheek until blood warmed between her teeth. Somewhere, a child's cry stopped and did not begin again. Hakon stepped forward like a cliff. He wore the air of law as plainly as his cloak. Men edged behind him, spears angled like syllables. The Thingstead smelled of wet ash and boiled sheep. People pressed in, faces still freckled with soot, their mouths full of small reckonings. Hakon of the Longfield speaks, the law speaker croaked, his palm on the carved staff, voice bare as a bone. He spoke the words that would strip a name from protection, and the syllables dropped like stones into the crowd. Asa listened where the pitch of the world narrowed to the beat of her heart. Hakon made no theater with the sentence. He lifted a small iron, plain, blackened, and let it heat on a brazier where two men tended the last fires. He did not ask for penance. He offered it. Payment, exile, submission. Behind him, men who had slept under the same roofs shuffled forward to claim what safety they could. The choice had been set into the room like a drawn haft. They seized her shoulder. Fingers were rough as peat. The iron seared a rune into the inside of her forearm, crude and shallow, a wolf rune, the mark of outlawry not by custom but by Hakon's particular cruelty. It smelled of burnt hide and copper. The pain cut through every other sensation and left a clean, exacting white light in her sight. "Out," Hakon said. "No law shall touch her. No oath will bind those who shelter her. Her goods are forfeit. Her kin may choose where order stands. He waited, as if that finality might bloom into repentance. No one moved to take her by the arm for the law's turnings except for two. Sigvar, young, a man who had once lashed an oar beside her, and a pale boy with ash in his eyelashes, Asa's foster son. Around them, loyalties calcified. Men with wives and halls to defend bowed their heads. Their choice was a hearth's weight. The widow, Eldred, stood at the circle's edge, hands folded in the way of women who hold their debt like a knife in the ribs. Her face was inked with smoke. Her mouth was a dry seam. She had come for blood, or for the heavy counting of silver that would turn anger into ledger. Now her eyes moved over Asa as if reading the new rune on the arm and did not change. "Take me with them," Asa said. The words spilled out flat as a plank. She would not accept Hakon's payment. She saw the look that crawled over the faces who stayed. Relief. Practical grief. Those men chose the law Hakon offered. The hearth outweighed the old loyalties. Sigvar stepped forward, hand trembling, and took the outlaw mark off her arm with his teeth as her thumb closed over the splintered runestick. Wind took the salt from her hair like a thief. A gull wheeled, indifferent as an oath. Leifer's hand hovered at her elbow and did not touch. Asa stood where the sea reached to claim the bones of the old key. Behind her, the village lay in tatters. Smoke-black beams, bent spears, a child's shoe half buried in driftwood. Men and women she loved had been taken, names thinned to a single stain. Her decision had made that stain. Leifer's breath smelled of iron and smoke. He folded his arms the way men fold knives when they can do nothing else. The hard click of a man keeping his hands from murder. "Run with us," he said once, each word a pleading stone. "We'll find timber, a hidden inlet. We'll go east past the reefs, where no Jarl follows." On the water, a small skiff rode the incoming swell. Oars rose and fell like a measured throat. The man who stepped ashore was not youthful. His face had been carved by winters of law. Jarl Hrold, who had lost his brother to the night the ships burned, wore his grief like a cloak. He moved with the quiet of a man who had decided the world must tilt back into balance. He wanted something in the world fixed, and that want made him terrible and right. "You are Asa of the North Strand," Hrold said without malice, as if naming weather. "You can leave and become outlaw, or you can come and answer at the thing. My brother will not speak. The law will." There it was. Not vengeance for its own sake, but the steadiness of law. He had a sister, a son, faces she could imagine. This was his way to hold them in place. He was no cartoon of cruelty. He was a man who measured blood because order could not